business, government, scientists, and citizen groups to support chemical policies to protect human health in the global environment. Blum's research and policy work with the Institute has contributed to preventing the use of flame retardants and other harmful chemicals in children's sleepwear, furniture, electronics, and other products worldwide. So with that, I can turn it over to Arlene.
Thank you. Looking forward to speaking with you, and let's just see if I can get the slides to show up. Oops. Okay, go back to the beginning. Okay, can people see this?
I can see that fine, yeah.
Oh, great. Okay. I'm going to be talking today about the chemical class approach, which can give us healthier products, healthier people, and indeed a healthier planet. And we're the Green Science Policy Institute. We write peer-reviewed papers. We bring decision makers together from government, business, academia, and the nonprofit sector. And then we communicate, and our papers are written with the goal to affect change and reduce harm from chemicals. And I would say they lead to water that has less harmful chemicals, air, soil, and ecosystems. We have a very robust communication system that I can share with you at the end, and many of our papers have tens of thousands of downloads, which is unusual in scientific papers, and indeed do lead directly to changes both in government policy and also in manufacturing practice and in purchasing by big companies. So, and I'll be giving you examples. To say I started as a chemistry student at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Was inspired by my freshman chemistry professor, who had a very young and had a doctorate in chemistry, and all the girls in my chemistry class got doctorates in chemistry. I also started mountain climbing at Reed, and indeed have climbed high mountains all over the world. And this story begins way back in the 70s, when there was a flame retardant called tris-2,3-dibromopropylphosphate, or brominated tris, that was in pretty much all the children's pajamas. It was up to 10% of the weight. And we were concerned, does it get into the children? And we found a child who'd never worn tris pajamas. Her mom had bought her pajamas in England, and we put her in the tris pajamas and collected her urine. And the first morning we found high levels of tris breakdown products that looked harmful. And indeed, then we checked, and tris was a mutagen. It changed DNA. So this was a big worry, and we wanted to try to do something about it. And then I got invited to, this is Mount Everest. And back then, no American woman had even tried to climb Mount Everest. So I had this interesting choice. Did I tell the parents of America about the harmful flame retardants in their kids' pajamas, or try to go climb Mount Everest? And so I did both. And so as I was going up through the big Khumbu icefall glaciers, across ladders, up steep ice faces, and in the great comb of Everest, every night I'd get to my tent and I'd write my paper. And then this is my high point in Everest. It was about nearly 25,000 feet, and my flag, the mutants, had a petri dish with few colonies, little tris, and then when you put more tris in the petri dish, you got lots more colonies, because tris did change DNA. So I sent my manuscript I was working on while I was climbing by mail runner to Kathmandu, and it was published way back when in Science as a lead article, and the subtitle says something about what we do at the Green Science Policy Institute. It says the main flame retardant in children's pajamas is a mutagen and should not be used. And I think that's a strong statement for scientists, right? What do most scientific papers end with? More study is needed. And here we just done a couple studies and we're making a very strong statement. But when we made that statement, it had an impact. And a few months later, the Consumer Product Safety Commission banned children's garments treated with tris. And that was brominated tris. But then a related chemical called chlorinated tris, the same structure with a chlorine instead of a bromine, was the replacement. And we ran more studies, and chlorinated tris also changed DNA. And we wrote more articles, and it was also removed from kids' pajamas. But what we didn't know is that it continued to be used in other products, such as furniture. In fact, if anyone has a couch with foam inside, and the couch was purchased between maybe 2006 to 2012, probably 5% of the weight of your foam in your couch is this same chlorinated tris. So I didn't know any of that. I continued mountain climbing. This is Annapurna 1. It's the 10th highest peak in the world. And when we decided to climb it, all the world's high mountains had been climbed but by men, but not by women. So I organized a women's team, and we did climb Annapurna. I wrote a couple of books, one about climbing Annapurna, and then a second one about how I ended up going to Annapurna, sort of a memoir of my life. And meanwhile, I had taken a long time off from being a scientist to climb mountains and have adventures and raise a family, and just came back to science. It's now been almost 20 years ago. And the issue that I was confronting is I found that the chlorinated tris was in furniture, and that there were so many thousands of chemicals on the market that really lacked adequate health and safety information, that it could take years to gather information about a chemical and regulate it. And then the tendency is of chemicals regulated to replace it with something that's similar in structure, function, and unfortunately toxicity. So this is called a regrettable substitute. On the left is a flame retardant. If you have an old television, about 15% of the weight in your plastic in your television is probably decabromo diphenyl ether. So that's 10 bromines around 2 phenyl rings with an ether bond in the center. And the deca ether turned out to be highly persistent. It would bioaccumulate up the food chain and toxic. And so deca ether was phased out of use, but the substitute was decaethane. Very similar in structure. It has an ethane bond instead of an ether bond. And it turns out that it's equally persistent, bioaccumulative. And when the substitution was made, the toxicity wasn't well known, but it turned out to be equally toxic, which is not surprising. And so if you have a newer television, the plastic is quite likely 15% by weight, the decabromoethane. And so that's not a great solution. And so what do you do about this tendency to go from one harmful chemical to another? And you think about the tens of thousands of individual chemicals. So I came up with the idea of grouping these chemicals into families or classes that have similar structure, function, and possible toxicity. And we held a retreat with people from government, business, academia, and the nonprofit world. And at our first retreat, we came up with the idea that there were 6 classes that contained a majority of the harmful chemicals in everyday products. And these are the 6 classes: PFAS, which we'll be talking about today, antimicrobials, flame retardants we'll also be talking about, bisphenols and phthalates, some solvents, and certain metals. And I encourage you to go to 6classes.org. You can watch a 4-minute video on each of the classes and an introduction. So there's 7 4-minute videos. In a half an hour, you can learn from each class where it's commonly used, why it's harmful, things you can do to reduce harm and exposure and levels in water. And we usually put in a success story, because a lot of people, when they watch these videos, they would get very concerned because they had no idea there were harmful chemicals in everyday products. So I encourage you to take 4 minutes and watch one, and if you like it, take a half an hour and watch all of them. So if a chemical is one of these classes, it's not necessarily harmful, but it's certainly a big red flag to be cautious and ask, is this chemical really necessary? If you say to a mom, you can have a kind of white carpet that you can drop wine and Coca-Cola on and it'll be fine, but you have to put PFAS on it, which is going to end up in your children's bodies for a long time and on the planet forever, she might not think it's worth it to have PFAS on her carpet. And if she really wants that stain repellent carpet, then let's go to green chemistry and come up with safer alternatives. So I first learned about PFAS trekking in the Himalayas. I was reading this book, Stain-Resistant, Nonstick, Waterproof, and Lethal, The Hidden Dangers of C8. This was in 2013, and I happened to be trekking with a chemist from Sweden who was an expert on PFAS. And everything I read in the book, she said, yes, that's the problem. And I came back and thought, goodness, we need, and I Googled, PFAS or fluorinated chemicals, PFCs, and there was very, very little in the press, but there were scientific papers. And so I said, well, why don't we get scientists together? They understand the problems, to talk about the problems of PFAS and what can be done. And so we started a monthly scientist call in 2013. This is our 10th anniversary. We've been talking once a month since 2013, and out of this calls have came a lot of scientific papers and a lot of good ideas that contributed to the current interest and regulation of PFAS. So PFAS are in nearly all of us, and as I'm not sure how familiar you are, but PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. The old PFAS that were commonly used were called C8. There were 8 carbons surrounded by fluorines with a carboxylic acid group at the end. It's called PFOA for acid. With a sulfonic group at the end, it's PFOS, P-O-F-O-S. And the reason that PFAS, I like to say they're my favorite class because they're the best and the worst. And that's because of the carbon-fluorine bond, one of the strongest bonds in the periodic table. It leads to lots of good properties like oil and water repellency, but the bond is almost impossible to break. So they're forever chemicals. They last for geologic time. Unfortunately, they travel in the environment. As I said, they never break down. They end up in people. Our bodies don't know how to deal with them, and they're associated with a whole range of harm. And this is from both animal studies and human epidemiology studies. And by the time you have human epidemiology studies, they're really out in the world. So in 2015, our scientist group wrote the Madrid Statement on, we called them highly fluorinated chemicals then, that was before PFAS had been coined, calling on the international community to cooperate in limiting the production and use of PFAS and to develop safer alternatives. And it was signed by several hundred scientists, published in Environmental Health Perspectives. And we did a big communications campaign, sort of the first time that PFAS really reached a large audience. And as you can see, we had these chemicals in pizza boxes and carpets last forever from National Geographic, Nick Kristof in the New York Times. If you're really interested in great journalism on PFAS, go to the Tough on Toxin series by Sharon Lerner in The Intercept. And then the New York Times cover story, The Lawyer Who Became DuPont's Worst Nightmare. And that's the story that led to the movie Dark Waters, which perhaps some of you have seen, where Mark Ruffalo plays Rob Bilott, the attorney who just worked incredibly hard to discover the PFAS problem in West Virginia and Ohio. The next year, I wrote an editorial in Science, bringing the PFAS message to the scientific community and asking the question, do we need this potential, given this chemical, given the potential for harm? So we wrote a number of papers in our group, we had some EPA scientists who around 2016 said there have been studies in drinking water throughout the country, finding a lot of drinking water sources containing PFAS. And we decided to see if we could map back from the drinking water that had PFAS to possible sources. And we discovered they were industrial production and manufacturing sites, military training areas, airports, and wastewater treatment plants. The wastewater treatment plants didn't produce it, but they concentrated PFAS from upstream, perhaps from chrome production and other uses of PFAS. And just as we were writing this paper, the EPA set a health advisory level of 70 nanograms per liter for the sum of the two long chains, the PFOA and the PFAS. And we were able to estimate that 6 million people had drinking water with levels above that 70 nanograms per liter. And this got a lot of press, a lot of concern. And actually, this paper, I think, had like 50,000 downloads. It got a lot of interest. So the level of what PFOA is allowable in drinking water has gone down over the years. In the 80s, DuPont said 5,000 parts per trillion, then 1,000. The EPA said 400, and then that 70 parts per trillion in 2016. But then a lot of the states came up with lower levels. And then the US EPA came out last year with a very, very low level. And it's not enforceable. These are health advisory levels. But when you start having low levels like that, it's in virtually all drinking water. So it's expensive to deal with PFAS contamination. For example, in Michigan, Wolverine made hush puppies and treated the leather with Scotchgard, which was PFOS, and dumped the leather scrap. Made sludge that was applied to fields, and then suburbs were built on those fields, and the level in drinking water in those suburbs were up to 58,000 parts per trillion. That's 842 times the US health advisory level. So the state of Michigan sued Wolverine, and Wolverine paid the state of Michigan nearly $70 million, and then Wolverine sued 3M, and they paid 3M nearly $55 million, so very expensive, lots of lawsuits. And cleaning up drinking water is really expensive. In North Carolina, where there was bad contamination of the Cape Fear River area from a Chemours plant, there was an estimate of $46 million to build a carbon filtration plant, nearly $3 million a year to operate it, and then reverse osmosis is needed to get rid of the whole witch's brew of long and short chain PFAS at the Chemours plant. And that was $99 million to build and nearly $3 million a year to operate, and for only 25,000 customers. It's really kind of unaffordable. And also a really memorable thing, Detlef Knopp, a scientist who first discovered the contamination in the Cape Fear River, said at that time when it rained in North Carolina and the rain went through the trees, the level of PFAS in the rainwater increased. And that's because of what had escaped from the stacks of the plant and just settled on the tree leaves. And so when you think about that, people for a very high cost can get clean drinking water, but what about the creatures in the trees, the birds and the bees and the bats? You know, the environment, the ecosystems can be contaminated forever. So that all points out that PFAS are problematic, difficult to clean up, and prevention is preferable. So now I'll tell you some more optimistic stories. If you've heard of Keen shoes, they're water shoes, and we work with Keen, and they decided to get rid of all the 6 classes from all their shoes, and they looked and found PFAS in 101 places, and they discovered 70 of the places that PFAS were not necessary, and they removed them right away. You know, water shoes don't have to be water repellent. But then the other 31 places took years of work to find replacements, but they found them, and they were successful, and they've written the Keen Green paper to help other shoemakers and others in the outdoor industry to much more quickly remove their PFAS. So if you're interested, you can Google the keen green paper and learn about their strategies for removing PFAS. One of the other papers from our scientist group, we looked at fast food packaging. I think it was back in 2017. I collected samples like from the organic restaurants in Berkeley and discovered about half of what we'd collected did contain PFAS. And so we wrote an article, we publicized it widely, and people in the Senate wrote letters. This is from Senator Blumenthal writing the CEOs of the major fast food companies, asking about the fluorinated chemicals in their packaging. So Senator Blumenthal's office did not get any answers, but we heard later from people who worked like with McDonald's that as soon as they got the letters, the fast food companies, and they read our paper, and we actually had a one-day meeting for the food packaging industry. When all that happened, McDonald's and the other companies knew that they needed to get the PFAS out, and they started a process. And in the last year, most of the fast food companies have indeed moved away from the use of PFAS. Not all. Carpeting is another success story. The largest source of PFAS exposure for children used to be from carpeting. Kids, crawl on the carpet, put their hands in their mouths, and PFAS treatment has been linked to high PFAS blood levels, people in homes with treated carpets. And so we decided to try to educate the carpet industry. We have what we call our Material Buyers Club, big companies who buy a lot of carpeting, Google, Meta, Salesforce, Genentech, and they invited the carpet industry to come to Berkeley, and they came from Georgia. And in the morning, they sort of walked in saying, we've changed from C6 to from C8, the long chain, to C6, the short chain, which is pretty much a regrettable substitute. And by the end of the day, carpet industry pretty much all committed to removing PFAS from all their carpets. Yeah, this is our Material Buyers Club, all of whom did not want PFAS in the carpets for their workforce or their students or their hospitals. And so that was 2018. They committed in 2 years to remove PFAS from carpets and rugs, and we knew it had been successful when in late 2019, Home Depot and Lowe's announced that they were phasing out selling rugs and carpets with PFAS, and that was because the carpet industry had found other non-fluorinated alternatives. Another example, a couple of years ago, we studied cosmetics, and about half of them did contain PFAS, particularly things like waterproof mascara, shiny foundation, glossy liquid lipstick, and they're direct paths from cosmetics into people, through tear ducts, inhalation, ingestion. Again, we did a lot of communication. The day our paper came out, the No PFAS in Cosmetics bills were released in both the House and the Senate, which we had worked to make happen. Those bills did not pass, but this past fall in California, the PFAS-Free Cosmetics Act did pass, banning all PFAS from being intentionally added to beauty and personal care products in California. And this is like, California is a big market, so it's likely to be followed across the US and Canada. A final example, we did a paper looking at children's school uniforms. There were high levels of PFAS in all the stain-resistant uniforms we tested, and I didn't know this, but about a quarter of the kids in the US wear school uniforms. And again, we publicized the paper a lot, and it contributed to a ban of PFAS in textiles in California, which leads also to help the outdoor industry move away from PFAS and textiles for many, many uses. And this also is going around the country. So all these are ways of preventing more PFAS, given how hard it is to clean it up once it's out there. The outdoor industry, I've been trying, look, in 2013, I first started trying to get the outdoor industry to come to Berkeley and have a meeting to talk about removing PFAS, and they were very resistant until after the California legislation passed. And so this November, we did have a meeting with the outdoor industry to help them figure out how to maintain the quality of their products without PFAS. And as I said, I was on a trip that climbed Mount Everest with no PFAS. You don't need it, and you can make good products without it. And I think the outdoor industry is all very grateful that we had major and minor brands there. We have if you go to our website, if you're interested in green science policy, there are lots of resources for the outdoor industry in removing PFAS. So if you're as interested in PFAS as I am, we have a PFAS website called PFAS Central. We have now 150 scientists on our PFAS calls, and they were all giving us all this information about PFAS that we shared with the scientists. And we decided to share it with everyone. So we update this once a week. It has the latest news on PFAS, the latest science. We read the papers and pick important ones and just summarize them. Policy, and the most popular page is our PFAS-Free page, where we list products that do not contain PFAS. We made this page for their communities that have been drinking PFAS-contaminated water from military bases and airports and production facilities, who have health problems, who really want to buy products with no PFAS. And so it lists, we don't test the products, but we ask the companies to put on their website that they are indeed PFAS-free. So you can go to PFAS-free if you'd like to get PFAS-free products. Okay, well, now I'm going to talk briefly about flame retardants. Do they save lives or cause harm? And really the thing about flame retardants, it's all about flammability standards. Does the standard that they meet provide a fire safety benefit, or doesn't it? So there's a standard called Technical Bulletin 117 that was passed in about 1976. It was a California standard, but it was followed throughout the US and Canada, and it required the foam inside furniture to withstand a small flame for 12 seconds. And it turns out this standard did not provide a fire safety benefit. To get that 12 seconds, the foam was 5% or more by weight, a flame retardant like chlorinated tris. And if you do a thought experiment and imagine dropping a candle on your couch, the fabric will burn, you'll have a large flame, and the foam will only resist the flame for a second or two. And there really is not a significant fire safety benefit because fires start in exterior fabric, not in filling. So the flame retardants inside furniture are called SVOCs, semi-volatile organics. They're continually coming out from inside the couch where they're concentrated, going into air, dropping into dust. You have some dust on your hand, you eat a sandwich, you're eating flame retardants. Cats will have up to 100 times higher level than people because of their grooming behavior. And toddlers who crawl in the dust and put their hands in their mouths will often have 3 to 10 times higher levels than their parents. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of studies, thousands of animal studies, and now dozens of human studies, and they found a lot of human health problems associated with exposure to flame retardants. The main flame retardant called penta-BDE that was used from the 70s till it was globally banned about 2005. Particularly pregnant women are vulnerable. If they have higher levels, it takes longer to get pregnant. Their thyroid hormones are altered in critical windows of brain development so that their children have a number of neurological reproductive problems, lower IQ. The average American child has lost 3 to 5 IQ points, who was a child during those years, or still has Penta furniture because furniture stays around quite a while. And when Penta was phased out, the replacement was our old friend chlorinated tris that had been in the children's pajamas. So is there a fire safety benefit? A number of studies showed that a couch with foam that met that California standard that had 5% by weight Penta or tris did not have a fire safety benefit over a couch with just plain foam. And so we had legislation here in California that you could increase fire safety without flame retardants by stopping fires in the fabric before they reached the flammable foam. We had a number of bills, and they were not successful. This is part of the first bill, a $7 million campaign from the chemical industry to stop legislation to change the standard to not need flame retardants. Group called Californians for Fire Safety turned out to be the 3 chemical companies that produced the chemicals. A journalist documented $21 million spent in Sacramento preventing the state from moving to increased fire safety without flame retardants. And that was back when I started the Institute, and we had like no budget. We were practically working for free, and the chemical industry was, you know, it was really challenging. So what did we do? We wrote scientific papers. This is a paper where we looked at 100 baby products and found flame retardants in 90 of them. As much as a baby's changing pad had 15% by weight chlorinated tris, which by then had been shown to be cancer-causing and a neurotoxin. This got a lot of attention, this paper. We got support from the manufacturing industries. This is the business and institutional furniture manufacturers, Steelcase, Herman Miller. We had a one-day workshop with them, and they explained that they'd done fire testing, that the flame retardants didn't make any difference. They didn't work, the standard did not work, so the flame retardants did not help. You don't want to say the flame retardants don't work. They meet the standard, but does the standard work? So they wrote here a statement in support of eliminating flame retardants from furniture. We had support from the foam industry, the home furniture industry, juvenile products, fabric industries. The firefighters supported not using flame retardants because when they burn, they produce dioxins and furans, which can contribute to cancer. Firefighters have high levels of the sorts of cancer associated with dioxin and furan exposure. I started hiking with Jerry Brown, who was then governor, his senior advisor, who happened to live in my neighborhood and have a dog. And in those days, anybody who hiked with me got a big earful about toxic flame retardants. And the governor really wanted to try to help us change the standard, but you know, the chemical industry was really a problem. And then a Chicago Tribune reporters who had won Pulitzer Prizes, really good reporters, came to one of these crazy hearings we would have where all the representatives would vote for the flame retardant lobbyists instead of scientists, firefighters, trade associations. And so they wrote a series called Playing with Fire, and that subtitle says it all. A deceptive campaign by industry brought toxic flame retardants into our homes and into our bodies, and the chemicals don't even work as promised. And this series won every journalism prize. If you Google Chicago Tribune Playing with Fire, you can read about it. It's real scandal and drama, very well written. And with help from the governor and the Chicago Tribune, California was able to change to a new standard called Technical Bulletin 117/2013. And there's a labeling law so that furniture would have a label like this that says contains no added flame retardants. And this was a big deal. So starting in about 2015, I'd say, if you're thinking about when you bought your couch, it'll probably have a label like this and not have flame retardants. And a couple years ago, this became a national standard. And it's what's called a smoldering standard, where the smoldering cigarettes, electrical fires are stopped in the fabric, and you don't need flame retardants to do it. So no flame retardants and modestly increased fire safety. So what we would call a real win-win. I will say after the law passed, the chemical industry sued the state of California and said they couldn't make such a law, but they lost. And as I said, it became a national standard. It was, again, a struggle. One of the COVID acts in 2020 that was like 450 pages long, it was called the last paragraph. It's called something like the work from home COVID safety regulations said that the national standard would be the California standard, which would stop fires in fabric rather than adding flame retardants to foam. Right now, we're working on the issue that high altitude or camping tents and children's tents still have flame retardants. And it's really an outdated standard that studies have been done showing that if you pitch a camping tent, you would have higher levels of, for example, chlorinated tris on your hands. And when you sleep in it, you breathe it. And certainly children would playing in such tents. So we've been working with Duke University on the study, and there's been a national change in standard so that flame retardants aren't needed, but each state has their own regulations. Like in California, the fire marshal still requires them, and it's actually taking legislation in California to stop the requirement for flame retardants in tents. But there is such legislation, and we're hoping it will pass this year. We're helping support it. Thing we're working on now is flame retardants in vehicles. It turns out that the same old chlorinated tris was used in vehicles because, again, there was an old 1960s flammability standard for the inside of vehicles. NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Authority, who's responsible, we've met with them a number of times. They do not have data to show fire safety benefit, but they say, you know, our goal is crashworthiness. Talk to the EPA about the problem. And I've tried to explain to them the EPA can't help the problem because, you know, they used to use penta-BDE and it was banned. So then they used chlorinated tris, the old kind, and they stopped using that, but they have a new chlorinated tris that they use. So we've just done a study of flame retardants in 100 cars, different kinds of cars. And we're trying to get, as we did with furniture, to get the automakers, trade associations, NGOs, to encourage NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Authority, to look again at their standard and see if they can update it to not lead to the use of flame retardants in our cars, because better not to be exposed from our couches, but we still don't want to be exposed from our cars. Well, I'll end with, here's a glamour picture. The flame retardants can be glamorous. Because of some of this work, here's the most glamorous night of my life. I was being inducted into the California Hall of Fame by Jerry Brown, and that's like Robert Redford on the left and Fernando Valenzuela, a famous baseball player. And anyway, lots of famous people, Joan Baez on the right, and we got gold medals, and it was all for the work on flame retardants. In fact, someone Jerry Brown's office said it might have been the most important thing he did for the state of California was to change the standard from the old standard, which he had signed into law when he was governor in 1970s and got changed when he was governor again. So I'll just end reminding you about the 6 classes videos. I hope you'll take half an hour and watch them. And if you want to learn more, our websites are greensciencepolicy.org, PFAScentral.org, where you can learn about PFAS, 6classes.org for the videos. And we send out a monthly newsletter with, I think, really interesting stories about all these things. And so you can subscribe on any of our websites. And if you don't like it, you can unsubscribe. So I encourage you to check out our newsletter. So now I'm going to see if I can figure out to get back to you. That worked. And and how do I stop the share? Okay. I can't see anybody. So I hope you have some questions.
Yeah, Arlene, thank you so much for an interesting talk. For everyone, we'll be happy to take some questions in the chat, which we can then read out to Arlene. So we have a question from Stephen. Are you aware of any uses on waterways that may get into lakes or reservoirs?
Well, you know, all kinds of things are near waterways. You know, all those things, airports, production facilities, chrome plating. And you know, it's really interesting. The San Francisco Estuary Institute, we have very high levels in marine mammals, birds, other creatures in the San Francisco Bay. And it's both in the South Bay, where we have military bases and airports, but also in the North Bay, where we don't have any of those. There's agriculture and people's homes. And one of the research projects we're working on right now is trying to determine how much might come from runoff on people's homes, because like roofing often has PFAS in it, paint, sealants, many of exterior products being used on homes. So it is a real question, where does the PFAS come from? You know, we know that those military bases, airports, production facilities, wastewater treatment plants all have PFAS, and the wastewater treatment plants, you know, concentrate it and it comes out. They don't capture it. So all of those things contribute, and we don't know how much just our everyday products contribute. You know, you wash your Gore-Tex jacket or your treated clothing, and how much goes into the wash water and then down the drain and then, you know, makes its way into bodies of water. I don't think that's well known. In fact, I'd be interested if anyone on the call knows about that. I'd be really curious, since you're the water experts. Can anyone say anything about where PFAS comes from, as far as you know, into water?
Yeah, I'm sure someone will have an answer for that. I mean, I think in California, we see it from a wide variety of sources, from military bases to wastewater effluents that enter waterways. I'll take another question from Mark. He asks, with regard to decreasing the use of these chemical classes in consumer products, how do you know when to use the carrot or the stick? Are most companies willing to phase them out voluntarily?
Well, that's a really good question. And I'd love it if anybody wants to come on screen. I'm an extrovert. I like seeing people. Anybody? I'm the only one on screen. Or maybe you are, but I can't see anybody. But there's somebody. Hello, Mark. Thank you. There's Kareem and there's Hal. Excellent. Thank you. I like talking to people more. These Zoom calls are kind of weird with all little boxes. Okay, so, oh dear, now I forgot the question. What was it again?
It was.
How do you know? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was basically just asking, because it seems like you've been working with a lot of different industries who are voluntarily decreasing the use of these products and hopefully not substituting them with something equally as bad. But I'm sure that you also get some pushback too. And so I was wondering, like, how do you know when to use the carrot or stick approach? And what are the steps if you don't get voluntary phasing out that you would take to get these products removed from or get the chemicals removed from consumer products?
Great question. And absolutely, we're the carrot, we're scientists, and our goal is to do good science. It's peer reviewed, that, you know, really in the best journals that reaches tens of thousands of people, and share that with industry and become a respected source of information, because the chemical industry doesn't, you know, their goal is maybe not education, but sales, frankly. So that's us. But there are many, most NGOs are more like the stick. And they both, excuse me, they both can be effective. And the most effective thing is government, because once the government regulates, you have a level playing field. So for example, with PFAS, we have these retreats. And in 2014, IKEA came to a retreat and said, oh my gosh, we have PFAS in our products. We're going to get it out, because IKEA is very value-based. And their chief chemist in Sweden, you know, said, let's have a call. 9 months later, she said, we've got it out of our shower curtains, our umbrellas, our raincoats, but we have these nice tablecloths, and they're alternatives for waterproof, but for stain repellency, there really isn't. And she said, so we can't make tablecloths at IKEA anymore because we're not going to sell any tablecloths because you need stain repellency. And that's like great values. They did that all over the world. And I thought, wow. And then a few companies, Crate and Barrel, heard that and said, we're not going to sell stain repellent treatments for our couches anymore. And Levi's heard it and they did something. And Kaiser Permanente said, we're going to make our hospital furniture PFAS-free. And I thought, wow, this is all happening. But that's about all that happened because most companies, it's the next quarter's stock price. That, you know what I mean? Those are all pretty much privately owned, value-based organizations. So like the outdoor industry, if you go to PFAS-Free, there are a bunch of outdoor companies that don't have PFAS, but the vast majority didn't start doing anything till California passed legislation saying they couldn't use it. But legislation can take a long time. So a story about that is in 2013, when we first did this, we had these videos that are 5 minutes. They were hour-long scientific calls in those days. They kept getting down. I will say Meta, which used to be called Facebook, told us, we want our designers to listen to your videos, but they only have a 4-minute attention span, so you've got to make them 4 minutes. And we did, because it's better, you know, people get the message quickly. But in any case, back in 2013, we did a video on antimicrobials, our lecture, and Target called us the next day and said, oh my gosh, we discovered we have triclosan in our personal care products, and we're going to take it out. It'll take us a year to get it out of our supply chain. Don't tell anyone, but it'll be gone in a year. Great. So it turns out that the FDA in about 1972 wrote something saying that triclosan appears to be carcinogenic and it doesn't appear to have a benefit, and we've got to do something about it. And in 2016, 42 years later, they regulated it. And it's really hard for government to regulate often. And in fact, triclosan was regulated, and the replacement are things, because we all went over to CVS across the street to see if there was triclosan, and there wasn't, but there were quaternary ammonium salts. And we have a paper coming out in May with 22 authors who study quaternary ammonium salts, showing how incredibly harmful they are. So that's the next regrettable substitute. And the pandemic only increased the use of quaternary ammonium salts, which all these things end up in water. And things that are antimicrobials, I didn't talk about it, but if it kills microbes, it's not a great thing to have in your water for the little creatures in the water. And indeed, triclosan, people put it in hand soap, but it really doesn't do any good unless you scrub for 2 minutes. So then, nobody washes their hands for 2 minutes. So it goes down the drain, goes up the food chain, and when part of the ban was because most American women had triclosan in their breast milk, which is not what you want. So, it's a combination of things. Government's the best, but it's really hard for government because they always have to listen to all stakeholders and the chemical industry. If I said back in the beginning, I didn't say my story, but when I started this institute, I hadn't been doing science for a long time. I'd taken a long break to climb mountains and raise a family and was working for free, just getting it started. And the chemical industry spent $23 million trying to shut down our work on flame retardants in furniture. So, only because Jerry Brown's friend, his senior advisor, had a dog, and I did make a point of meeting him and starting going hiking with him, and the governor learned about it and decided to do something, so it's like you do everything you can, but the American Chemical Council has a lot of resources, and they're very committed to keeping or increasing the use of their chemicals, sadly. But long answer, but important question.
Great answer, Arlene. I think we'll take a couple more questions. We had one from Kimmy. Do you want to ask that? So you're on mute.
Obviously impressed by your work. Amazing. Thank you very much. And it seems like a lot of your campaigns are so successful because your research is proving the health hazards of this. Was that funded directly by your organization, or was that more of just bringing together those involved with the research that was already happening and then getting it into the public eye?
So we don't actually do the research. We partner with the best scientists in the world, frankly. So like with PFAS, we started these calls 10 years ago. So we're all friends. And with the pandemic, we got to see each other's houses and pets and kids. And so we've been talking the first Wednesday morning every month. We have spoken every single Wednesday since 2013. And so when we have an idea like, where do those PFAS, the UCMR, where the government looks for high levels of unregulated contaminants. So when the EPA people on the call said, what are we going to do? I said, well, does anybody on the call do mapping? And Elsie Sunderland from Harvard said, oh, my student is a great mapper and she'll map it. So we've used those calls or I said, let's look at fast food packaging. That's a worry, So we've used those calls to have scientists. We are now well-funded, I will say. In fact, if you sign up for our newsletter, it'll always have a little thing, please donate. But we're actually well-funded by foundations. One of our funders, when we started in 2013, gave us a very small amount of money to study PFAS. And, so many things came out of it. They now give millions to us, and we don't get millions, but to many, many NGOs to study PFAS because they've had so many results, So people realize that science can have, and we try to maintain that we're impartial scientists doing things in the public interest. And that's kind of an unusual niche that we occupy.
If I may, I'd like to ask one more question. We have a small high altitude watershed for our source, and I would be concerned about manufacturing, but I would be interested in knowing about PFAS in any snowmobile related products or fluids or ski wax or ski products and fluids, because that is what I have in the watershed.
Oh dear. Where, in the Sierras?
Yes. Yeah.
Where?
About 7,200 feet in Bear Valley.
I wish I were there with you. It looks nice. How's the skiing?
Yeah, we're getting buried this year. So hopefully there's lots of dilution. But
well, ski wax used to have it. I think it is really on the way out. For the Olympics, they banned it, though it's hard to enforce. Right. I will say that the kind of glide when it's sticky in California, I put on a long time ago, had PFAS, and then I stopped using it. And then this year I saw the same brand said PFAS-Free. Okay. So now I bought the PFAS-Free variety. I think it's on the way out with ski wax, but people have left over ski wax. Snowmobiles, I don't really know, but it's a lot of places in cars. We've been working with the car industry on both flame retardants, and they're more concerned about PFAS because PFAS is, in Europe, there's just been a regulation to try to phase out all non-essential uses of PFAS. And the car manufacturers, they said 20% of their parts contain PFAS. And they're very concerned about that. And we do think, as in those Keen shoes, about 2/3 of the uses aren't really necessary for these chemicals, like antimicrobials. You don't really want antimicrobial soap. You don't need antimicrobial countertops or doorknobs, if you're a surgeon, maybe you need antimicrobials to really scrub. So a lot of the uses are marketing. Like my favorite socks, I discovered they said, the blister socks, they said they have PFAS in them. Well, you don't need PFAS in your socks. I wrote the manufacturer and said, please, no more. So it's a lot of marketing for these chemicals, and that use you can just get rid of really easily. But, they were good for ski wax, and now they've developed ski waxes that maybe aren't quite as good like for the Olympics, but for all the rest of us, they're really good. So.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. But what a great job. I'd love to have a job at 7,200. You get to go skiing every day.
Pretty fun. Yep.
How's the snow?
It is very dense. We've had some rain on snow, so it is high water content. But we just got 8 inches last night, so Good day.
Well, if you go to my website, arleneblum.com, and sign my little box and tell me who you are, maybe I'll say hello and go skiing when I go skiing up there sometime.
Anytime. Would love
Okay.
to.
Well, if you go to my personal website,
Okay.
there's a place. So,
Will do.
thanks.
Thank you.
So,
Hal, do you want to sneak in one last quick question?
Sure. That's what a huge challenge you have in front of you, and what a lot of great success. Have you tried to work with government agencies to reduce PFAS in like what contractors can use, or what the government actually buys for their employees, because they are being a government employee, you know, I could see how we can make a difference that way.
yeah, so Biden is actually committed to reducing PFAS. It's not as big as climate for him, but it is something. And government purchasing is a great place. We started working, it turns out, even under Trump, the National Defense Authorization Act was a place, the national budget for the military. We were able to put in maybe 5 years ago that when the packaging for rations for the military would not contain PFAS, and a list of products that the military couldn't purchase. So we've done stuff around military purchasing, and we'd love to do stuff around general purchasing. So that is a really good idea. And so I'm going to actually end with my favorite metaphor, if you want, because as you know, I think, did I say right? So I led the first ascent of American ascent of Annapurna 1, which is considered the most dangerous of the world's high mountains, with an all-women's team. And I like to say, when you climb a mountain like Annapurna, it's really hard. You know, you just have to plod. You know, there's storms and there's avalanches and there's rockfall and there's occasional yetis popping out in your way, and you just have to keep plodding up the mountain. And the people you're roped to, your lives are interdependent, because if somebody falls, you can all die. And what I feel like now, what I'm doing is really similar. I'm a lot older. My knees aren't so good. My book Breaking Trail discusses, I spent a year walking all the way across all the Himalayas, which is like from here to New York, with 1,000 meters a day up and down every day for a year. So my knees are not great. So I don't climb those high mountains anymore. But the work that we're all doing together is really similar. And we know what the goal is: a healthier world. And you have to just plod upward, and there are avalanches and rock falls and lots of yetis. You have to get by. And I like to feel like I have this big team. We're all roped together. And I hope you guys are part of the team. I hope you'll sign up for my mailing list and hear from me once a month, and we can all climb together. And we need to, because if we slip and fall, it's not just us that dies, but the whole planet. And this, I think, it's really important that we reduce the use of these chemicals. And remember, probably 2/3 of the use are not even needed. And so anyway, so I'm going to leave you with asking you to be on this expedition. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time and expertise, Arlene. And thanks everyone who was able to join today. We have an upcoming webinar next month on management of cyanohabs and current issues. So I hope many of you will join us for that. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Arlene.
Good
Bye.
job. Yep.